Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Costa. I work with the School of Cities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this December session of Knowledge Cafe's 2025-26 season, featuring Dr. Alex Ramiller of U of T's Department of Geography and Planning. Knowledge Cafe at the School of Cities is a monthly speaking opportunity for members of the U of T tri-campus community to present insights and highlights of their research on a theme that is important and relevant to cities. It provides a platform for faculty, students, and researchers who are working to uncover solutions to creating more just, equitable, sustainable, and prosperous cities. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. This land, covered by Treaty 13, is the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit, and continues to be the gathering place of many Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples from across Turtle Island. As we hear of alternative approaches to home ownership today, we invite you to think of the colonial histories of the lands they occupy and Indigenous approaches to land stewardship and conservation in relation to ownership. Alex Ramiller is an assistant professor in geography and planning at the University of Toronto. His research uses large data sets to explore the impact of housing and land use policy on urban spatial inequality, with a particular focus on the interaction between housing programs, neighborhood context, and individual outcomes such as income, wealth, and debt. Now, just before I turn the presentation over to Alex, I'd like to remind everyone of just a few housekeeping items. First, you'll notice that all your microphones are muted for the duration of the presentation. If you wish to ask a question live during the question and answer period, you can request to be unmuted and a staff member will help you. You can also use the chat function at any time to type in your questions or comments. They'll be collected and we'll get to as many questions as we can following the presentation. Finally, we ask that everyone please practice respect and good etiquette. Anyone demonstrating inappropriate language or behavior will be removed from the session. Now, without any further ado, I'm very excited to hand over today's session to Alex. So take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Costa. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. I want to express my gratitude to the School of Cities for inviting me to give this talk today about the extent and impacts of alternative homeownership models. Today's talk represents really the synthesis of several different projects that I've had the opportunity to work on over the past few years around this general topic of alternatives to sort of traditional forms of homeownership. And I also want to express my gratitude right at the front to my collaborators on the various components of this work, including Arthur Acklin, Vince Wang, Jeff Gusoff, Alex Schafrin, and Lizzie Matuzzi. So here is just a brief outline for today's talk. I want to begin by providing some of the context about the current state of homeownership, specifically focusing on the United States, which is where all of the research that I did for today's talk was conducted. So I'm going to provide some context about homeownership in the US. And I will also be talking a little bit about the concept of housing tenure, with really a goal of complicating the way that we tend to think about housing tenure as this binary between homeownership and renting. Second, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the landscape of alternative homeownership models, really focusing on what I refer to as shared ownership models of housing. After that, I'm going to talk about some of the research that I've conducted on the impacts of one subset of alternative homeownership models known as shared equity homeownership. And finally, I'm going to offer some conclusions and general implications. So as I said, this talk is concerned primarily with homeownership in the United States. And so to that end, I thought it would be useful to start things off by providing you all with a little bit of background on what homeownership in the US looks like. So homeownership rates have remained really remarkably stable over the past several decades in the US, floating just around roughly 2/3 of all households. This figure has fluctuated up and down a little bit over time in response to trends such as, first of all, the expansion of credit during the early 2000s, and then, of course, the post-2008 recession. But all of these sort of macroeconomic conditions have all tended to only move the needle temporarily. Homeownership is really heavily embedded in the US context, but it also has, it seems, both a floor and a ceiling, given the sort of current array of of institutions and economic incentives that exist. This is actually extremely comparable to Canada, which historically has had a very similar level of homeownership. During the 2010s in particular, Canada had a slightly higher homeownership rate, but that has been slowly declining over the past 10, 15 years or so. A really long-standing feature of this home ownership dominated housing market in the US is that homeownership has not been equally available to all groups. Non-white households in general, and really Black households in particular, have consistently experienced lower access to homeownership due to a combination of historical housing practices such as redlining and discriminatory lending that really limited access to mortgage finance, as well as continuing and really perpetual income and wealth disparities by race. So this figure that I've included on the right here shows the gap between white and Black households in homeownership rates from 1980 all the way through 2020, and shows that rather than shrinking over time, this gap has actually grown in homeownership rates. So in 1980, roughly 69% of white households owned their home compared to 45% of Black households. So about a 24 percentage point gap between those two groups. But that has actually increased to about a 30 percentage point gap by actually 2019, so just before the COVID-19 pandemic. This is also true to some extent for Hispanic households in the US. While homeownership rates have been climbing steadily over time for Hispanic households, the gap in homeownership rates has remained pretty similar over time, at around 25 or 24 percentage points. So the bottom line here is just that there are these really persistent racial disparities in access to homeownership, despite the fact that homeownership is a really significant part of the US housing market and of the US housing experience. Beyond these racial divides, there are a number of other important gaps that are emerging in access to homeownership. And the one that I really want to highlight here is also the decline in homeownership amongst younger households. And this decline can really be observed among households between 25 and 55, with particularly precipitous declines among households that are in that sort of youngest age bracket that I'm showing here. So households that are between 25 and 34, more than half of those households used to own a home in 1980, and now that figure has dropped quite significantly. The only sort of age group that has seen their homeownership rate increase over the past 40 years are folks that are 55 or older. And this is despite the fact that we see a rather consistent homeownership rate over time overall. So that suggests that there's sort of growing inequality in terms of who has access to homeownership by age as well. And so these trends reflect that there are these really significant and in some cases growing barriers to entering the homeownership market. One of the most significant of these barriers that's often raised is the rising cost of buying a home. The median home sale price in the US increased fivefold essentially between 1980 and 2020, going from only $65,000 back in the 80s to over $300,000 in 2020. And actually, immediately after 2020, we saw home prices shoot up even more significantly, going briefly above 400,000 in response to the sort of various disruptions associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. In the meantime, however, the median family income has really not kept pace with this rapid price appreciation, resulting in a growing gap between the cost of accessing homeownership and the resources that are actually available to the median family. And so this can help to sort of explain some of what's going on with these persistent gaps we see both by race and increasingly by age as well. With all of that background in mind, I want to take a step back and think about why exactly homeownership is considered so important in the first place. Things like the homeownership rate, things like the racial gap in homeownership are really heavily looked at, examined over time. There's a great interest, for example, in closing that homeownership gap. But why is access to homeownership, why is increasing the homeownership rate seen as so important? Homeownership is so heavily embedded in the North American approach to housing that it can be easy sometimes for us to take it for granted. The sort of short answer here is that homeownership has the potential to offer a number of advantages. Chief amongst these is the opportunity to build wealth via home equity. There are a couple of different channels by which this wealth building can occur. The first and most obvious is that house price appreciation. So the fact that you see this steady and seemingly inexorable growth in home prices over the past several decades means that households often buy a home with the expectation that their home is either going to retain or most likely gain value over time, so that when they sell that home, a decade or two down the line, they will have a significantly larger amount of money. Beyond price appreciation, homeownership also contributes to household wealth building through a mechanism known as forced savings, by which households basically consistently are contributing to their own wealth each month by paying off some of the principal on their home. So, someone is paying off a mortgage every single month, but at the end of paying off that mortgage, the household has basically paid off the value of their home and holds full control over the wealth that is embedded in that physical asset. Beyond wealth building, there are sort of other reasons that are commonly cited for why homeownership is seen as so important. There is the sort of argument around greater housing stability relative to renting, given that homeowners are not generally subject to things such as lease expirations, landlord decisions to sell, or things like no-cause evictions. And finally, and less tangibly, ownership over a housing unit tends to provide a household with a greater control over altering and improving their home, as well as the greater feeling of security that can come with ownership. Now, this is sort of the standard line around the benefits of homeownership versus renting, but it's worth noting that none of these benefits are necessarily a given. Many of these advantages are not inherent to homeownership itself, but are sort of amplified and reinforced through pro-homeownership policies. This includes things in the US, such as government mortgage insurance, as well as homeowner-friendly tax deductions that make homeownership both financially and just generally attractive. By comparison, there's a lack of similar supports for renters, both in terms of opportunities to build wealth, but also in terms of stability, with many fewer sort of legal restrictions around things like evictions, for example, which makes renting far less appealing. This is not necessarily the case in other institutional contexts, such as certain European countries, where the context around renting provides actually a much greater degree of stability than it does in North America. But in any case, given this institutional context, this lack of access to homeownership is really a pretty major barrier to economic mobility because accessing homeownership gives households the opportunity to build wealth over time. It gives them the stability they need to do things like, have a stable job and build sort of a life around a home. So all of this brings me to the first study that I really wanted to highlight in today's talk, which was an attempt to effectively complicate our understanding of what homeownership looks like, broaden our perspective on homeownership, and start to think about ways to address the barriers that we still see in homeownership access, in particular with respect to race and ethnicity and age, but also with respect to sort of income and resources. The fact that it is much more difficult, for example, to access homeownership if you have low income. So the central challenge that this particular report, which was co-authored with folks from the San Francisco Federal Reserve, sought to address is that homeownership in the US is frequently conceptualized pretty much solely in terms of single-family homeownership. In other words, there's this really sort of dominant concept of what homeownership looks like, and that image is essentially a standalone house that is owned and occupied by a single family. This idea remains extremely prevalent, both in the sort of policy conversations around homeownership, but also, frankly, in the data that government agencies collect about housing markets. When you're looking at things around homeownership rates, for example, or analyses of homeownership and housing, the sort of wealth building potential of housing, there's often this sort of sole focus on single family homeownership, where there is this unambiguous ownership of an entire property that a house sits on. As a result, the landscape of homeownership beyond this sort of single family archetype has often gone largely under-examined in the US context. So in this report, we used a combination of census data sources, property records from the company CoreLogic, and various other sort of industry sources, basically to try to identify and quantify the scale of various alternatives to single-family homeownership that currently exist across the US. And as a starting point for this inquiry, it was really necessary to reframe our approach to what we mean by housing tenure. So housing tenure technically refers to any sort of legal and financial arrangement by which somebody occupies a housing unit. And it can theoretically include any sort of relationship between people and housing. However, this concept is often simplified to this really binary delineation between homeownership on the one hand and renting on the other hand. Indeed, if you look up the sort of definition of housing tenure according to government agencies, both in the US and in Canada, they will often describe housing tenure as owning or renting. They don't even provide the sort of overarching definition that I just did of legal and financial arrangements. They just say housing tenure refers to owning or renting. And while that is part of the story, it is not the entire story. So while renting and owning clearly constitute very different forms of housing and relations between occupants and the housing units they occupy, tenure is not simply this binary set of housing types, but rather exists as a range of possible relationships between housing and its occupants. And this range can be defined broadly based on levels of control over the physical property and levels of ability to extract wealth from that property. So I've sort of set up a spectrum here where we can start to think about some of these things, with one end being less control over property and less opportunity for wealth extraction, and the other end being more control and more wealth extraction. And renting and homeownership do clearly occupy sort of different ends, even opposite ends of the spectrum. So with rental units, they offer relatively little control over the unit itself in many cases, and also provide essentially no opportunity to gain wealth simply by occupying the unit. When you occupy a rental unit, you are paying rent each month, but that rent is not going to come back to you in the form of wealth down the road. On the opposite end of the spectrum, single-family homeownership offers a very high degree of control over one's housing unit, including relative freedom to alter and improve the house and the surrounding property as well in many cases. And homeownership, of course, also offers the opportunity to build wealth through those mechanisms I described just a few moments ago about price appreciation and forced savings. However, there are other housing types that do exist along this spectrum, somewhere between that full control and full wealth building and the lack of control and lack of wealth building. And it's one particular sort of segment of this spectrum that I want to focus on today, focusing specifically on types of homeownership that provide less control and wealth extraction potential than single-family homeownership, but nonetheless provide many of the advantages that homeownership tends to have. And this subset I'm going to describe as shared ownership models because they involve the homeowner sharing the privileges and responsibilities of ownership either with other homeowners or perhaps with an organization. The first of these is going to be very familiar to the urban Canadian context, which is the condominium. Now, this structure provides individual ownership of each individual housing unit, generally speaking within sort of a multi-family, multi-unit structure, but it features collective ownership of common spaces and of infrastructure. This model of housing offers quite a high level of wealth building and control, but somewhat less so than single-family homeownership. And this is due to the fact that you do have this sort of shared or collective ownership over common spaces and common infrastructure. Our analysis of property data across the US found that there are roughly 5.4 million owner-occupied condo units across the US, which represent roughly 6% of all owner-occupied units in the country. This represents roughly 70% of the total stock of housing units in condos, with the remainder either being vacant or being occupied by renters. It's worth noting here that this is very different from the Canadian context, where, of course, condos are quite common. Um, Condos in the Canadian context tend to be much more sort of balanced between owning and renting because condos have become a very important part of the rental market as well. Whereas condos in the US context tend to be much more heavily oriented towards owner occupancy. The other thing worth noting is that condos tend to be concentrated in a relatively small number of places in the US. They're really concentrated primarily in regional housing markets such as South Florida, Honolulu, and some major cities on the coast of California. Overall, though, condos are not a particularly large segment of the homeownership market at a national scale. While they may sort of break the 15 or 20% mark of owner-occupied units in these handful of places that I mentioned, in most places it's like less than 5%. Now, overall, the main way that condos have the potential to benefit affordable homeownership, sort of increasing the opportunity for people to access homeownership in general, is by the fact that they have relatively lower sales prices compared with single-family homes. This is due probably to a couple of things. They're generally smaller sizes, for one thing, mean that they're going to be sort of more affordable than a standalone single-family house, as well as the fact that they effectively are diluting the land costs because when you're buying a condo, you're buying a single unit that is in usually a multi-unit structure. Whereas when you're buying a single family home, you're buying a structure and all of the land that surrounds it. So as of late 2025, the median sales price for condos in the US was about 20% cheaper than for single family homes, which is a really meaningful difference that amounts to nearly $100,000 and could be a deciding factor between whether a household can afford homeownership or not. And it's worth noting too that this is national scale figures. This gap is probably more significant in higher cost markets where some of these condos tend to be located. And it's worth noting as well that outside of contexts where condos are favored, such as especially South Florida and Honolulu, other places, such as California even, only have condos by sort of the virtue of legacies of prior eras of development. And there are many laws that restrict condo conversions that, are intended to preserve existing affordable housing, but can also substantially limit the expansion of the condo stock. Another shared form of housing tenure that we looked at is cooperative ownership, in which each owner-occupant controls ownership shares in a collective property. So, for example, in a 100-unit owner-occupied co-op building, for example, purchasing a co-op unit effectively means that you're purchasing a 1% share in the ownership of the overall organization that owns the co-op as a whole. This structure sort of necessarily reduces control over one's housing because decisions are being made collectively by all of the co-op owners. Now, again, it should be noted that this form of housing cooperative is not the same as what we see in Canada, generally speaking, where you see more of rental and nonprofit cooperatives. In that the owner-occupied form of co-ops, especially in the US, do tend to promote access to equity and have the potential to see that equity increase over time. It's just that instead of that equity being represented by ownership of a property deed, for example, that ownership is contained within an ownership share of the co-op organization. While this may reduce the entry costs of purchasing co-op housing, there's also a subset of cooperative housing that is known as limited equity housing cooperatives, or LEHCs. These models are special in that they restrict the resale price of ownership shares, which is really intended to maintain the long-term affordability of cooperative ownership. Effectively, when one buys into a limited equity cooperative, part of the terms of their co-op share is that there will be some limitation on how much they can sell that share for in the future. This ensures that when a new household wants to enter the co-op, they will still be able to do so at an affordable price, even if the sort of market rate housing prices or the market rate price for a share of the co-op has increased rapidly. Now, even more so than condos, owner-occupied cooperatives occupy an extremely, extremely small segment of the homeownership market in the US. We counted around 670,000 units across the entire country, or less than 1% of the owner-occupied housing stock in total. It's also worth noting that a significant chunk of the co-ops that do exist are located specifically in New York City, where they make up about 40% of the total owner-occupied housing stock. And this is once again just due to sort of a historical legacy of how housing is developed in that one particular place. And so co-ops are quite common, particularly in Manhattan, for example. But outside of New York, this type of owner-occupied co-op is largely absent from the US housing scene, beyond sort of a few scattered individual projects. And this lack of co-ops actually poses some major challenges for the future expansion of co-ops as well, simply because there is not effectively a critical mass to create common institutional infrastructure around how to manage and how to finance cooperatives. And financing actually ends up being one of the huge barriers that we identified to the expansion of this type of housing model. Because while financial institutions know very well how to handle a single family home mortgage in the US, a co-op mortgage is really pretty unfamiliar still. And there's actually only one major lender to co-ops called the National Co-op Bank. So this leaves limited options for financing, either of entire co-op developments for development financing or for purchasing co-op shares for individual sort of co-op buyers. The last form of in-between housing tenure that I wanted to highlight in this talk is the community land trust model, or also known as the CLT model. And the CLT model is innovative in that it basically separates the ownership of land and of individual housing units. While in some ways this is actually somewhat similar to the condo model in the sense that you have individual ownership of housing units and shared ownership of collective infrastructure, the CLT model differs in that the land is owned by a nonprofit or a community organization that permanently holds that land out of the housing market. That land is then leased to the occupant of the housing unit. Now, importantly, this ground lease model, where effectively the organization that owns the land is leasing that land to the homeowner, is effectively an agreement between the organization and the occupant. And that ground lease, similarly to those limited equity housing cooperative models that I mentioned a second ago, also includes conditions that limit the resale price when the occupant decides to sell their unit. In other words, these resale restrictions effectively maintain long-term affordability by preventing the house price from rising too much over time. There's basically an artificial cap that's placed on how much the house price can increase so that it remains relatively affordable over time. Now, it's worth mentioning that despite the sort of promising aspects of this model, particularly for maintaining long-term homeownership, or long-term affordable homeownership, I should say, it remains extremely limited in scale across the US. There are only about 15,600 owner-occupied CLT units nationwide, according to a recent census of community land trusts. And that represents, 0.02% of the housing stock in the US, so very, very small. There are slightly higher concentrations in a few places. So Vermont, for example, has a quite well-established set of community land trusts that operate, particularly around the city of Burlington. There's also concentrations in places such as Colorado and in the Pacific Northwest. But generally speaking, these organizations represent very, very small slices of the overall homeownership market. And as I will be discussing in a little bit, there are some serious barriers that they face to like substantial expansion and scaling up of this model. So this overview is in no ways intended to be exhaustive of all possible housing tenures, and there are actually a number of other important ones we covered in our report, which I highly recommend everybody check out later, including things such as manufactured home parks, split ownership models that exist that allow for like legal division of ownership of a single house, as well as less formal living arrangements like people living in multi-generational households and things like that. These are all extremely important variations on the homeownership experience as well. But these three models that I've covered today capture the core of what I would describe as shared ownership in the sense that you have this sort of legal ownership of the property on which a homeowner lives being divided in some manner. These various shared ownership models have the potential to provide more affordable alternatives to single-family homeownership. As I suggested, in some cases, this greater affordability is in some ways incidental, in that it stems from the smaller size of the units, the lower embedded land costs, or perhaps even lack of familiarity with the ownership structure that may discourage demand. For example, if people don't understand how a co-op works, or especially financial institutions don't understand how a co-op works, that might have the effect of driving down the demand for it. But nonetheless, I want to sort of move past those incidental explanations for how we can make alternative forms of homeownership more affordable and think about these models that explicitly focus on affordable homeownership as a goal. And these models, generally speaking, at least the ones that I'll be talking about today, are known as shared equity homeownership models, in which not only the ownership is shared, but effectively the potential for wealth extraction is also being shared. This subset of shared ownership models that include sharing equity include community land trusts, as well as the subset of co-ops known as limited equity housing cooperatives. It's worth noting there are also other shared equity models that do exist, such as housing units with deed restrictions to maintain long-term affordability, which essentially provide the same benefits. But in short, all of these shared equity models extend the logic of shared ownership to also include shared wealth building, with the current occupant effectively sharing their wealth with future occupants by accepting effectively a lower equity gain when they sell their home. Now, this shared equity homeownership model does have significant potential to increase access to homeownership, particularly among groups that have traditionally faced constraints. So some of those groups that I was mentioning right at the top of the presentation. These statistics here, which are from the policy and advocacy organization Grounded Solutions Network, which does a lot of work around community land trust and shared equity advocacy, really tells this story. So they find that 95% of shared equity homes are priced affordably, meaning that the low income home buyers are paying less than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. They also found that 7 out of 10 shared equity homeowners are first-time home buyers, reflecting the importance of affordable homeownership as a channel really particularly for younger households. So many of those folks in the 25 to 34 or 35 to 44 age brackets are going to be first-time home buyers. And they are also the groups that are seeing sort of the greatest declines in homeownership rates over time. So increasing access for first-time home buyers is really crucial. While historically the share of non-white households in shared equity homes has been relatively low, partially just due to the locations where shared equity homeownership programs have historically tended to be located, that figure increased to 43% in recent years, reflecting a trend towards greater racial inclusion in these shared equity programs. And lastly, and perhaps in some ways most significantly, 6 out of the 10 residents of shared equity programs ultimately used the equity that they gained through these programs to eventually purchase a quote unquote traditional market rate home. So effectively, by entering shared equity homeownership, often as a first-time home buyer, it's allowing people a way to get on what is sometimes referred to in policy as the homeownership ladder, basically giving them that first step that then allows them to buy another home down the road. So in short, this model does have significant potential to promote long-term affordability. However, we actually, up until recently, have known relatively little about how participating in a shared equity homeownership program actually impacts the participants. And so this leads me to a set of research questions that I explored in collaboration with some of my colleagues at the University of Washington and UCLA. And we really wanted to understand what are some of the implications of living in shared equity homeownership for the actual occupants. And perhaps most significantly, we wanted to ask, do the resale restrictions, these ones that are limiting the potential price increases of these shared equity units, actually impact the ability of residents to build wealth? After all, the idea of shared equity homeownership is to artificially restrict the amount of home price increase that can occur over time. But that also means, in theory, that those homeowners that are living in those units aren't making as much wealth, aren't gaining as much wealth over time as they would otherwise. So we wanted to understand what is the impact on wealth building. And we also wanted to understand to what extent does moving into shared equity homeownership impact residents' locational outcomes in terms of key neighborhood indicators such as exposure to neighborhood poverty, access to transportation, and some spatial determinants of health. And this is important because, there's a growing body of research in the US suggesting that where one lives can make a huge difference in terms of impacting various life outcomes. And so understanding how shared equity homeownership models fit into the broader housing landscape and what sort of neighborhood contexts they are sort of exposing residents to is very important in terms of understanding the sort of complete picture of how shared equity homeownership is impacting residents. So I'm going to start with this first question concerning the impact of shared equity homeownership models on wealth building. And this really reflects one of the most major critiques of shared equity programs in general. As I said, they artificially constrain potential equity growth. And so it could mean that the lower income households that tend to participate in these programs are not able to take full advantage of their homeownership. An important context for asking this question is the massive existing wealth gap between quote unquote conventional homeowners and renters. As I mentioned earlier, homeowners are able to benefit from home equity growth in various ways, whereas renters have few sources of potential wealth. And so I just now want to quantify that statement a little bit. According to the 2019 Survey of Consumer Finance, the median net worth of homeowners in the US is over $255,000, while the median net worth of renters is only $6,300. So that's nearly 40 times more wealth for homeowners compared with renters. And a great deal of that is specifically due to home equity. And so there is this concern that because shared equity homeownership restricts the amount of potential equity, it might reduce that wealth building potential and mean that they're going to basically fall somewhere between renters and homeowners. So our goal with this analysis was to compare between shared equity homeowners and conventional homeowners as well as conventional renters in order to understand basically, is there a difference in their wealth building potential over time? And to do this, shared equity homeownership data was drawn from the Homekeeper database, which is a national inventory of shared equity homeownership programs produced by the Grounded Solutions Network, that same advocacy network that I mentioned a few slides ago. The data on quote unquote conventional homeowners as well as renters was drawn from the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, or PSID, which is a long-running longitudinal survey that follows the same families in the US and asks them detailed questions about their income and finances over time. One important problem to note here with doing this type of comparison is that it has to confront the fact that shared equity homeowners, basically the people who are participating in these programs, are not necessarily going to resemble the full population of conventional homeowners and renters, with the potential for really marked demographic and socioeconomic differences between these populations. The solution that we used to this problem was to employ propensity score matching, which is basically a statistical technique that allows us to create balanced comparison groups. And in this case, those comparison groups are going to be the conventional homeowners and conventional renters. And we basically use this technique to create samples that resembled the shared equity homeowners along various dimensions, including age, race, income, household structure, time period, and regional context. Just to provide a little visual of this, we basically started with all conventional homeowners from the PSID, and then we found a matched subset of those homeowners that resembled people who were in the shared equity homeownership programs. And so our first comparison was between those shared equity homeowners and that matched subset of conventional homeowners. And we also did the same thing with renters. While unfortunately, the shared equity homeownership data that we had only included information on wealth that was specifically associated with home equity, we wanted to understand how much wealth of any kind are renters gaining over time. Basically, how big is that gap we're seeing between the experience of shared equity homeowners in terms of wealth building and how much wealth, if any, renters were gaining during that same time period. And so the results from this analysis were really quite striking, I would say. On average, we found that shared equity homeowner households gained around $1,650 in home equity for each year that they participated in the program. By comparison, demographically and socioeconomically similar conventional homeowners gained on average around $2,080 in home equity each year. It's worth noting, however, that the distance between these two values is not statistically significant. In other words, even though the value for equity wealth gain did seem to be a little bit higher for conventional homeowners, there is no statistical evidence that conventional homeowners actually gained more wealth than shared equity homeowners. This is a somewhat surprising finding, given that we would expect those resale price restrictions to have a dampening effect on wealth gains. However, I think this may be partially explained by the fact that the households we're looking at here for conventional homeownership are specifically ones that are demographically and socioeconomically similar. That means they tend to be lower income homeowners or homeowners that are parts of groups that tend to be more marginalized in the housing market. This means that these conventional homeowners, for various reasons, are probably not going to be able to gain as much wealth as, wealthier homeowners, for example. But if we're just looking at this sort of one-to-one comparison, it seems like there's actually not as big of a difference as we might think in wealth building potential. Now, if we compare these figures with demographically and socioeconomically similar renters, we see that renters only gain $16 in wealth of any kind per year. Now, of course, they did not gain anything in terms of home equity because they were renters, but they could have gained other forms of wealth through, for example, investing, through, other sort of sources like that. But effectively, that did not seem to be the case. Indeed, this value was not statistically significant from zero, meaning that effectively similar renters experienced no wealth gains over time. So, in short, shared equity homeownership provides similar wealth building opportunities as conventional homeownership, and significantly more wealth building potential than renting. Okay, I know I'm running a bit short on time, so I'm just going to briefly go through this last section of the presentation. Our second set of questions, as I said before, was around locational outcomes with respect to sort of the neighborhood context that shared equity homeowners moved into. And in order to examine this, it involved a similar sort of analysis. I'm just going to be focusing here on people that moved from renting into conventional homeownership, compared with households that moved from renting into shared equity homeownership. Once again, using matching in order to ensure that these two populations looked relatively similar. Compared with moves from renting into conventional homeownership, moves into shared equity homeownership appeared to result in increases in neighborhood poverty. So shared equity homeowners tended to move into higher poverty neighborhoods, but it had no significant impact on other sort of measures such as school quality that are very relevant in terms of sort of the socioeconomic outcomes of households. When it came to transportation access, found that shared equity homeowners experienced decreases in transportation costs and increases in access to public transit, indicating that shared equity homeownership units tended to be located in more central locations relative to conventional homeownership units, particularly in those sort of urban areas where community land trusts are more likely to be operating in more central and dense urban neighborhoods in general. And lastly, we also examined several neighborhood measures related to spatial determinants related to public health, things like walkability and food access, and found that moves to shared equity homeownership units also substantially increased both of these measures relative to moving into conventional homeownership. And this suggests that moves into shared equity homeownership also have benefits in terms of the neighborhood amenities that these households have access to. So in short, moving into shared equity homeownership increases exposure to poverty versus conventional homeownership, which to some extent reflects the property acquisition constraints that shared equity homeownership organizations face. It's really hard to acquire the land and to acquire the properties to operate shared equity housing. And so they're probably doing so in places where land costs are lower. Those may be places where, there's more sort of socioeconomic disadvantage and poverty, but these are also going to be places where there's greater accessibility and walkability and things like that because they tend to be in sort of disinvested urban areas. This is also just part of the focus of many of these organizations, such as community land trusts, which are focused in particular urban neighborhoods, for example. Okay, so as a way of a brief conclusion, bringing together the results of these various studies, this talk has really sought to provide an overview of some alternatives to the dominant frame of single-family homeownership, focusing on those shared ownership models I mentioned as potential alternative strategies to provide more affordable access to homeownership, particularly for lower income households, for households of color, and for younger households. Some of these models, such as condos and market rate housing cooperatives, may be more affordable simply by virtue of their relative size, which is still very significant given how expensive housing has become, particularly for single-family homes. And indeed, these models could be particularly appealing in expensive urban areas where space for conventional single-family homeownership is quite limited and where infill housing is now a much more significant policy focus. Um, However, as has really been seen in cities such as Toronto, building shared ownership types such as condos is not a guarantee of true affordability. And for that reason, I have also focused on this important subset of shared ownership models that explicitly enforce long-term affordability by sharing equity as well. And as this research has shown, shared equity homeownership models actually provide quite meaningful wealth building opportunities that are all not that different from those provided by conventional homeownership. They also can offer improvements in spatial accessibility and neighborhood amenities relative to conventional homeownership for low and moderate income households, reflecting the potential for shared equity homeownership to increase access to more desirable neighborhoods that might otherwise be out of reach for prospective homeowners. However, it's important to note that these programs remain extremely limited in scale, collectively making up a tiny, tiny fraction of all owner-occupied units, with the exception of condos, which are only a relatively small fraction. As I mentioned previously, there are only around 15,000 owner-occupied community land trust units in the US, and there's perhaps another 100,000 or so that are in limited equity housing cooperatives. Although most of those LEHC units are ones that were produced a long time ago, and that number has been declining over time. These programs face really significant spatial and financial constraints to future expansion, which represents a really serious barrier to spreading the advantages of shared equity homeownership more broadly. This limited scale and spatial unevenness of shared equity homeownership programs is exacerbated by various factors that are really important to consider from a policy perspective. There's barriers to property acquisition that come from things such as high land and housing costs that make it very difficult for individual organizations to purchase the land that they need to expand their housing stock. There's also really limited operational financing due to low fees, particularly in community land trusts. The ground lease fees they charge to homeowners are pretty low, which increases reliance on external funding and limits staff capacity, basically forcing these organizations to constantly be searching for additional funding to keep their programs running. And there's also really limited access to housing finance resources, due in part to a lack of knowledge about co-ops and community land trust models amongst financial institutions.
Hey,
So,
Alex.
yeah.
Oh, I hope you're wrapping up. I'm sorry to say, we'll have to turn to questions now since we're in the last 10 minutes here. So is that all good with you that we go to that? Thank
This
you
is
so
actually
much.
my very last slide, so no problem.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, if you want to go to your last slide, that's all good.
Yeah, sorry about that. So just very briefly, like active government participation is super important in terms of overcoming some of these barriers. Things such as property acquisition funds, community opportunity to purchase, inclusionary zoning, these can all be super important, as well as just increased financing, both public and private. And I'm happy to talk about that more in my responses as well. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks again, Alex, for really interesting insights on alternative homeownership models. So, as I said, we'll turn to questions right now. So, if anyone has questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand and we'll turn to those questions first before we check the ones in the chat. So, whoever's got something on their mind. Okay, so, while people think or build up the courage to ask something live, I'll turn to the earlier questions in the chat. There's one from Jeff Kettle asking, what about life lease models? I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, Alex?
I'm sorry to say, I don't think I'm familiar with that terminology. So if Jeff wants to clarify perhaps what that means.
Okay. Um, While we wait on that, there's another question in the chat from Paramita, who says, interesting findings regarding SEH residents and conventional homeowners. Do you think the results would have been different if the PSM matching criteria were different? Have you tested the same using different sets of matching criteria?
Yes, fantastic question. Thank you, Paramita. So the short answer is yes, we did test sort of different criteria. Sort of many different iterations went into this, and the results were broadly similar as far as the sort of key findings. The fact is that it was just very difficult to identify any statistically significant differences between the shared equity homeowners and the traditional homeowners along the lines that we used. Like I said, if we hadn't used that type of matching, I do expect that conventional homeowners would have greater wealth building just because there tend to be sort of higher income, for example, households that weren't being included in this comparison, and households that maybe had access to more expensive homes that would gain wealth faster. But overall, we found that for the comparison we were looking at, there was no sort of appreciable difference. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Okay, so another question I see in the chat from Nathan, who says, fantastic research, Alex. Really interested to see that there's no significant impact on equity building. One of the things we're seeing with CLTs in Canada is that it's a very piecemeal approach. Individual cities have their own land trusts, but there's not a lot of regional coordination. I know there are some CLT people here today who may want to contribute to that. And Nathan asks, is this similar to the landscape in the US, or are they more coordinated and connected to upper levels of government?
Yeah, fantastic question, Nathan. And I think that is one of the sort of key challenges that this type of model faces, is the need for greater sort of shared infrastructure that operates not just sort of in individual locations, but operates nationally. There are sort of national networks and advocacy organizations. I mentioned, for example, Grounded Solutions Network in the US, which has done a lot of really important advocacy and policy research work in this space, as well as sort of starting conversations between different community land trusts. But I would say that it is still very piecemeal. And the extent to which there's sort of government involvement, it tends to be local governments partnering with community land trusts for individual one-off projects. So we have yet to see a sort of concerted institutional effort to scale that up. But I think that is really crucial to the long-term success and scalability of this model, is to sort of strengthen these links and acknowledge the fact that even though obviously these organizations are operating within specific communities, they have shared needs, they have shared goals, and they could really benefit from shared infrastructure, particularly when it comes to things like policy advocacy, as well as things like I mentioned, like financing, where there's really pretty huge gaps, and these organizations can often struggle to get banks to pay attention to them, basically. So yeah, great question.
Thanks, Alex. I see another question from Allison who asks, what do these findings tell us about using a shared home equity model for seniors looking to move out of their large homes and into shared properties?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that one thing that is often sort of overlooked in the homeownership conversation is what it looks like for aging, particularly given the sort of demographic shifts that the US and Canada are both experiencing, particularly in the coming decades. Homeownership rates, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, are quite high amongst older households. But those households also do face growing challenges. Things like, for example, really high property tax bills. Even if they've paid off the value of their house, that ends up becoming quite a burden for people who are not making regular wage income anymore. So I do think that sort of shared ownership models, things like I mentioned, like condos and cooperatives, but also shared equity models that sort of reduce those flat costs or those operational costs over time could be really beneficial, not just for first-time home buyers, but also for people who are hoping to age in place. And, maybe in the case of shared ownership models, to take advantage of some of that shared infrastructure that something like a condo or a co-op can provide. So thank you for that.
Thanks again for that answer, Alex. Now, since we only have a couple minutes left, I think we'll have to call things now and wrap everything up. So we want to thank everyone for attending today, and thank you, of course, to Alex, most of all, for this fantastic presentation on a topic I know we're all very curious about. I would like to increase my own equity more than $16 a year for sure. So, for everyone who's joined today, our next Knowledge Cafe will feature Dr. Zainab Farouki of U of T's Department of Historical Studies and will concern the rise of online political extremism. So, that should be really interesting to check out too. Austin has posted a link in the chat. And finally, please consider subscribing to the School of Cities on whatever your favorite social media channels are. And to explore those, there's another link posted in the chat. So thanks everyone for joining today. And thanks once again, Alex. Have a great afternoon, everyone.